I've been asked to talk about the risks and opportunities. I'm going to start off with a couple of introductory comments and then go through the risks and then on to the opportunities. Just by way of introduction, first of all, to say my approach, since I'm not a scientist, is to come at this as a public policy approach, from the point of view of a political scientist. My own feeling is that climate change is no longer a scientific issue. I think the debate has moved on. I think the scientists have lost it anyway. When you look at the degree of as Graham has pointed out, that trying to be rational with people doesn't always work. I'm going to come back to that point a little later, because it can also work, I think, in our favour. My own feeling is that the Australian emissions trading scheme, the carbon pollution reduction scheme, whatever, is really a bit like the free trade debate that we had in Australia in the 70s and 80s. When the Commonwealth of Australia was formed in 1901, we had a policy of protectionism, which meant that we prevented the easy importation of goods, and that meant that there are a lot of jobs for Australians at home, but a limited number of goods that you could get, particularly, for example, in clothing. So that kept up the cost of clothing, it restricted the choice of clothing, but it guaranteed jobs for Australians. In the 1970s, we began a debate, some people would call this neoclassical economics, new right economic rationalism. The overall impact was to reduce that element of protectionism. And that really kicked in fact, in 1983 with the Hawke Labor government. But the debate had actually started well back in the 1970s. What is interesting is the debate had gone back and forth, looking that there were going to be winners and losers, to use a phrase that Tim had used in his presentation. We knew there were going to be winners and losers if you started to reduce the protection of, for example, textiles or whatever. What has happened now, of course, 20, 30 years later, we've destroyed most of our textile industry. So Australians who were employed in the textile industry, amongst others, have now lost a lot of the jobs. On the other hand, we have more choice of clothing, and we have it at a cheaper rate for those who want to buy clothes at a cheaper rate. So it's a debate that went on. Overall, it was an act of faith. We went forward in faith in the hope that somehow it'll be an improvement. I think that for many Australians, it would be seen as an improvement. That's how I've come at the whole debate about emissions trading. Because the more I hear, the less I understand. The more modelling that goes on seems to be more and more confusing. So in a sense, therefore, I think you just have to move forward in faith. Also in that context, and follows on another comment that Tim Flannery made, is the whole question about how you get progress in business. We saw recently the passing of a management pioneer, Professor Russ Ackoff, and he looked at the way in which change goes on within the American business community. And he made a couple of observations. One is that you don't wait for others in the business to start changing. You just go ahead and do it. And he found that the most successful forms of change management in the United States came from people who just did it, just started ahead and go and did it. And secondly, that as you do it, bear in mind that you've got other people who also need to be brought in behind you. So you do your own thing, you try to bring in others as you go along. And in a sense, I think that's what we will see with the climate change debate. I think that we have seen people doing particular initiatives, and I think bit by bit we will move forward. There won't be a magic blinding moment when everybody is converted. You're never going to get that. You're going to get your climate deniers all the way through. As Tim said, we've still got some people who don't even believe the theory of evolution. 150 years after the theory was proposed. So, I think that you're just going to have to go ahead one step at a time. Built into this is this notion of inappropriate fears and unrealistic expectations that I think has been generated by the Rudd Labor Party. If you go back to November 2007, Kevin Rudd very sophisticatedly used fear of climate change to win the election. I don't blame him. Politicians use fear all the time, You know, the previous Prime Minister did brilliantly with asylum seekers. Kevin Rudd used that same technique against him on climate change. I think that the Rudd government has generated unrealistic expectations on what Australia can do. First of all, we're only 1% of global emissions. We are not a major player. As Tim said this morning, 40% of emissions come from the United States and China. They are the big players. We're small players. Secondly, no matter what Australia were to do, the Great Barrier Reef, if it really is threatened, cannot be saved by Australian action alone, no matter how perfect our record is, because it's a global issue. It's not an Australian issue alone. And thirdly, that any pioneering work that Australia does itself, particularly before the Copenhagen negotiations, will actually only have limited effect. If you look at what happens, again, going back to the Australian context of free trade, we reduced farm subsidies in this country. The Americans and the Europeans did not. They still maintain high farm subsidies. We have the most efficient farming sector in the world. The Europeans have one of the worst farming sectors in the world. If you believe in reincarnation, hope that you come back as a cow in Europe rather than a human being in Africa. You'll have a higher standard of living. Such is the rate of subsidy on every cow in Europe. We reduced our subsidies on farming. The Europeans didn't. So our unilateral actions in the 70s and 80s didn't therefore set up a good chain reaction. So I think one just has to bear in mind that Australia is limited in what we can do. Now, this doesn't give us an excuse to do nothing, but particularly, of course, since our own per capita emissions are so bad. But it just means that we have to be fairly realistic about what we can do. I might just note, by the way, that New South Wales was an international pioneer in carbon trading. The Minister paid tribute to the work that we've been doing with precincts, but we also need to bear in mind, and basics, but we're also a pioneer in carbon trading and the arrangement with the Tokyo Electricity and Power Corporation, TEPCO. I think it's the first in the world that we're planting trees for the Japanese. So New South Wales is a pioneer. So just a couple of comments. One, therefore, I have a public policy approach. I'm not a scientist. And secondly, I am a little concerned about the Rudd government's use of fears and expectations. Let me get on and just identify some of the risks. I think one risk is that a government, the Rudd government or whoever, will be tempted to go for the symptoms, to just deal with the immediate issues, such as beach erosion, because long-term plans will take you beyond the next election whenever that takes place, not just the current government, but subsequent governments. So it would be much more tempting to do the easy ones, which would be, say, trying to protect the beach. Therefore, we could end up over the years winning battles but losing the wars.